In the silence of a storm, when the world seemed emptied of mercy, Elias McGraw trudged through snow that swallowed the sound of his boots. The sky had been erased, turned to a white haze, and every breath he drew burned in his chest like fire pressed into ice. His barn stood in the distance, half buried in drifts, its roof groaning under the weight of the blizzard. It should have been just another night of surviving, just another storm endured. But that night carried something more. That night the storm was about to give him a sight that would not let him remain the same man. Elias had been a quiet figure in the small town of Willow Creek, known more for his silence than his company. Since the passing of his wife, he had worked his land alone, his days strung together like beads on a thread, each one unremarkable, each one heavy. Town gossip often circled around him, men at the saloon saying he lacked grit, women muttering at the mercantile that grief had hollowed him beyond repair. He bore the whispers with bowed shoulders, telling himself he had chosen solitude. Yet, under the weight of that solitude, shame had taken root. The storm stung his face, driving him forward, his arms loaded with firewood. He paused at the sound of something unusual, a metallic rattle carried on the wind. He stood still, listening. Again it came, the harsh, desperate clank of iron against iron. He followed the sound, heart pounding in his chest, until the snow parted enough for him to see. Two horses stood chained in the storm's grip. A gray mare lay collapsed, her sides heaving, her breath misting weakly into the cold. Beside her, a chestnut stallion strained at the heavy links, hooves digging into the snow as though sheer will could break the iron that bound them. The sight froze Elias where he stood. Their manes were crusted with ice, their eyes wild yet pleading. The mare's head lolled, her body trembling in surrender. The farmer's heart clenched. For a moment he thought of turning back, of telling himself the storm would take them and there was nothing he could do. In his mind, the voices of Willow Creek echoed cruelly. McGraw's too soft. Always was. Ain't got the steel to make it out here. His hands, already numbed by the cold, trembled at the thought of their judgment. He remembered a night long ago when a neighbor had called for help, and he had stayed inside, too afraid to step into the storm. That memory had followed him like a shadow, and now it rose again to accuse him. But as he knelt beside the gray mare, pressing his gloved hand against her trembling side, the shame melted into something else. The stallion tossed his head, eyes fierce, hooves thrashing dangerously close, yet Elias stayed still, speaking softly, his voice cracked but steady. "Easy now. I'm not here to hurt you." The chains rattled with every movement, heavy and cold against the snow. Elias reached for the links, fingers stiff as he fumbled against the frozen metal. The stallion snorted, hot breath cutting through the storm, and for a heartbeat Elias feared he would be trampled. But then the horse stilled, as though some unspoken recognition passed between them. Man and beast, both bound by loneliness, both weary from carrying too much. Bit by bit, Elias wrestled with the chains, the iron biting at his skin through soaked gloves. The snow seeped through his coat, his knees buried in the drift. His breath fogged and hung in the air as he worked. At last, one section of the chain loosened, falling slack with a dull thud. The stallion pulled back, testing his freedom, but instead of bolting, he pressed close to the mare, nudging her neck, urging her to rise. The mare did not move. She shuddered, her strength fading with each passing second. Elias bent lower, his hand brushing her frosted mane. "You're not dying here," he whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of his own vow. "Not while I've breath left in me." The storm howled. But in that circle of snow and chain and trembling life, a man long haunted by silence found the courage to act, not for himself, but for something beyond him. The chains lay broken in his hands, and the night was no longer the same. The storm raged on through the night, yet within the dim glow of Elias McGraw's barn, a different world flickered to life. The great doors groaned shut behind him as he dragged the gray mare inside, her body heavy against the chains he used now as makeshift harness. The chestnut stallion followed close, hooves striking sparks of defiance on the frozen ground before yielding to the shelter's warmth. The storm roared outside, but in here only the sound of ragged breath and the crackle of Elias's lantern flame filled the air. The mare collapsed onto the straw, her sides rising and falling with shallow rhythm. Elias sank to his knees beside her, his rough hands trembling as he spread blankets over her body. The stallion watched, muscles taut, ears pinned back, every inch of him ready to defend. Elias did not shy away. He spoke aloud in the quiet, a voice grown unused to company. "Easy, Rustwind," he murmured, naming the stallion by the color of his coat. "She's safe now. She'll live, if we give her reason." His words, spoken into the barn's dim stillness, surprised him. For years he had kept his voice locked inside, as though the world no longer deserved to hear it. But tonight, the silence seemed to demand breaking. Through the long hours, Elias worked. He fetched water warmed on the stove, held it to the mare's lips, whispering encouragement when she took the smallest sip. He rubbed her legs, coaxed circulation into frozen limbs. Outside, snow beat like drums on the roof. Yet inside, time slowed into steady breaths and the creak of straw beneath shifting weight. His grief, his shame, all of it bent around this fragile moment of keeping life tethered to the world. At dawn, the storm softened and the barn door creaked open. A figure stepped through. Clara Boone, her wool cloak white with snow, her face framed by a dark scarf. Widow of the gunsmith, Clara was known in Willow Creek for her sharp tongue and steady gaze, a woman who had endured loss yet held herself with quiet dignity. She had come, she admitted, under the guise of concern sent by the townsfolk, but gossip had been her true errand. The people of Willow Creek wanted to know what Elias McGraw had been doing alone through the storm. She stopped short at the sight. The stallion, his chestnut coat gleaming in the lantern light, stood guard. The gray mare lay beneath heavy blankets. Elias crouched beside her, his hands steady as though he had done this 1,000 times. For a long breath, Clara said nothing. Then, softly, "They'd have frozen without you." Elias, unused to company, bowed his head. He expected ridicule, the same tone he'd heard in town for years. But Clara's voice carried no mockery. Only something gentler, almost reverent. She stepped closer, laying down a small bundle she had carried, bread wrapped in cloth, a flask of broth. Without asking, she knelt opposite him and began to help. By evening, the town was already buzzing. Word had spread. Elias McGraw, the man once too timid to help a neighbor, had dragged 2 half-dead horses out of a storm. The saloon rang with laughter at his expense, men calling him a fool for wasting time on wild stock that couldn't be tamed. The sheriff himself sneered when Elias came for supplies. "Chains break easy when a man's got nothing better to do." The sting of humiliation cut deep. Elias felt their judgment like old wounds reopened. But when he returned to the barn and the stallion pressed his head against his shoulder in wordless trust, the shame faltered. Clara came often after that, under excuses that grew thinner each time. She brought herbs for poultices, mended blankets, shared quiet company. They spoke little, but their gestures built something fragile and warm. She handed him a scarf one night, her fingers brushing his wrist, and Elias felt something stir in him that had long been buried. He caught her watching him once as he leaned against the stallion's flank, his rough hands stroking the animal's mane. Her gaze lingered, soft as snowfall. She said only, "They trust you. Maybe that's all any of us ever need." Days passed. The mare, whom Elias called Silver Shadow, grew stronger, her breaths less ragged, her steps steadier. Rustwind's fire remained, but now it burned with loyalty rather than rage. In their resilience, Elias saw his own reflection, once chained by shame, now learning to stand free. Then, just as thaw began to touch the edges of the land, trouble arrived. A pair of riders came to Elias's farm, faces hard with the kind of cruelty born of greed. They carried chains coiled at their saddles and claimed the horses as theirs, captured in the wild weeks before. Their voices dripped contempt. "You wasted your firewood and blankets, old man. These beasts'll fetch good coin once we've got 'em docile again." Elias felt the familiar weight of fear press on him, the memory of every time he had bowed his head to avoid conflict. The riders dismounted, reaching for the chains. The stallion's ears flattened, nostrils flaring. Silver Shadow stood close by, her coat gleaming, her strength returned. And Clara, who had been with Elias that day, stepped to his side, her chin raised, her presence like a steady flame. Something inside Elias refused to bend this time. He moved between the strangers and the horses, his voice quiet but unyielding. "These chains won't touch them again." The riders laughed, but their laughter faltered when Rustwind reared, hooves cutting the air, eyes blazing like fire in the dark. The mare stamped the ground beside him, no longer frail but fierce. Together, they were a force the riders had not expected. The men cursed, retreating under the stallion's furious display. Clara stood steady at Elias's side, her hand brushing his arm, a gesture both intimate and resolute. In the silence that followed, with the men gone and the chains left lying in the snow, Elias felt something unclench deep in his chest. He had stood his ground. He had chosen dignity over fear. The barn seemed to exhale with him. Rustwind lowered his head, pressing it into Elias's chest. Silver Shadow nickered softly, her breath warm in the cool air. Clara's eyes shone with something unspoken, something that needed no words. Later, as the sun broke through thinning clouds and the snow began to glisten with the promise of spring, Elias stood at the barn door with Clara at his side and the horses close behind. He felt the weight of his years, his loneliness, but also the strange lightness of a man who had been given back to himself. "Some storms," he whispered, more to the wind than to her, strip a man down to his bones. Others gift him back the marrow of his soul. And as the thaw spread across Willow Creek, the farmer who had once been a shadow walked forward with his horses and with Clara into a life no longer chained by shame, but lifted by grace.